My name is Martha Cole, and I am the Outreach and Interpretation Program Manager at the Montana Historical Society. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you here to hear Cities of the Dead and to welcome our speaker, Lauren Hunley. Lauren has spent nearly 20 years in the museum field, and she is currently the community historian at the Western Heritage Center in Billings. She also serves on the board of directors for the Mountain Plains Museum Association and the Montana Association of Museums. Her current projects include a multi-year Communities with Disabilities Oral History project, which I'm really excited to hear about when it's finished. But today, as I said, she will be talking to us about Cemetery in her program, Cities of the Dead. So please welcome Lauren Hunley.
Okay, all right. Well, I am very excited to be here. I will thank you for scheduling this week and not last week. The driving was much better today. If you're here for ghost stories, that's not what we're doing. We are going to take a look today at how cemeteries have developed historically, why certain cemeteries look the way they do in relation to their community needs, and we're going to do that specifically through the lens of a couple cemeteries in Billings and a couple cemeteries here in Helena, because there are some fantastic examples in both locations that illustrate not only statewide, Montana-wide trends in cemetery planning, but also national trends. So when we think about cemeteries, we have to acknowledge the fact that every community needs a way to honorably, respectfully, and hygienically dispose of their dead. Right? For us, it's out of sight, out of mind. We don't really think about it until we need it, but it's such a vital component to community quality and community development, community vitality. There are thousands of cemeteries across the state of Montana. Every town, community, ranch, every place that there are at least 3 people, you see a plan for how to culturally and honorably acknowledge a person's life and visit them in their death. I don't know if you guys realize this, but of the thousands of cemeteries in Montana, nearly 50% of them are over a century old. Nearly 15% of them are over 150 years old. So nearly 15% of the cemeteries that we acknowledge today and recognize today have been interring people since 1887. That really gives us an idea of how important and how deeply rooted the concept of cemeteries are. But in order to acknowledge and recognize colonial cemeteries, non-native cemeteries, and the way that non-native communities disposed of their dead, we have to take a second to acknowledge our native neighbors. So when we're thinking about native burials, I'm using the word burial here in its pejorative, and it's a really big general term, because when we think about our Blackfeet and our Kootenai and our Upsalaga and our Tsitsitsa and all of our other tribal neighbors, the way that they disposed of their dead actually created, pardon the pun, it created the groundwork for the way that non-native communities came in, because many of the earliest domestic non-native cemeteries were put in a specific location that was already set aside for the dead, meaning they recognized where their native neighbors were already disposing of their dead, and they used the same location. I'm going to speak very generally about native burials because most Northern Plains tribes had a very similar practice. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Crow, even the Blackfeet, and the Flathead, and many, many more, used what we now consider to be scaffold burials. They didn't actually bury people. Instead, they really looked for those high points across their territory, and if a high point like a cliff didn't exist, then they used a natural high point on the plain, like a tree, and if you're in the middle of eastern Montana and there are no cliffs or trees, you create one and you build a scaffold. The earliest scaffold burials that we have written record of are just simply a platform elevated with a body wrapped, usually in blankets, tied down with rawhides, and then left with some of the most important components of that person's life. Jewelry, clothing, sometimes we see weapons and other war-related components. But these are not things that happen in isolation. You know, very rarely would a non-native person just randomly come across a scaffold in the middle of nowhere. Our tribal neighbors still had areas recognized where the dead could be kept together. Apparently, community is as important in death as it is in life. And so we see this borne out, we see this really, really evidently in Billings. I'm gonna make an assumption that most of us have at least driven through Billings. When you go through Billings, there is a very, very obvious and evident geographic feature that you know you're in Billings because you can see the rims. In 1880, I don't know, quick contextual lesson, Billings is not the first non-native community in the valley. It was Colson. Colson was established in 1877, and very quickly, because when we look at the type of people who were living in Colson, most of the ladies who were not there are not the ladies you would take home to meet your mother. So the type of people who were living in Colson met death pretty regularly. They needed a place to put the dead. Interestingly enough, they document that only about 1.5 to 2 miles from the Colson community proper was a place already acknowledged as a place of the dead, specifically for the Apseliga people, for the Crow people. In 1880, Dr. Allen, who was serving in Colson, wrote in his diary that he noticed hawks and crows hovering over what he called Skeleton Cliff. He followed the birds and he discovered on top of the cliff bright colored cloth that was hanging from nearly every tree, and each held a skeleton, and he counted more than 100. These bodies were draped in bright blankets, bound to trees with rawhide. They had elk teeth, moccasins, brass and copper rings, and other articles found among and scattered among the trees. For many of these tribal members who participate in a scaffold burial, they would often come back later and gather up the remains of their family and then pull those remains together. There's also a story, it's kind of hard to pin down in the historical record, but right at the base of this cliff, kind of over here, is where the Metro Park, it's where the fairgrounds currently are. There is a story that a Crow encampment at the fairgrounds in the 1880s-ish, 1870s, 1880s, that the encampment came down with smallpox, and that the majority of those living or associated with the lodges died. When their family members came back in, they gathered up their bodies along with other skeletal remains and deposited them all together. Dr. Allen recognizes that they actually deposited those bones into the crevices of the cliff face. And so he acknowledges that the Crow people, the Apseliga people, called this place Skeleton Cliff, or the place of the skull. The place of the skull continues in many of our cultural maps and Billings. As you can see here, you'll see Boot Hill Cemetery, and just below it on the map is Skeleton Cliff. Now, when we think about Native peoples, it doesn't take very long for the practice of being able to find the high places around their territory to to be able to leave your family, to leave your lodge, and to travel to where these places are. It doesn't take very long for that to become more and more challenging, especially as they're forced onto reservation land. And so how do their cultural practices shift and adjust during that time period? Well, very quickly, we see that they start blending Western Judeo-Christian practices with their cultural practices. We see this with the Crow, we see it with the Cheyenne, and we really see it with the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota Siouan people. So here you can see that they've started using coffins, but they're still using raised scaffold burials. Well, as their movement often on the reservations are limited even more, as we get to the turn of the century, it gets to a point where only certain Native people are allowed to leave the reservation land, and they have to do so with a pass and permission from their Indian agent and supervisor. It's more difficult for a whole family to travel out to honor their dead. So then we start seeing cemeteries on Native land. Interestingly enough, most of those cemeteries for the first several decades only include non-Native burials. For example, the earliest burials in cemeteries now on the Blackfeet Reservation near Browning is Louis Seuss, who died in 1850. He was a trapper who married a Blackfeet woman. Even though these cemeteries exist, many Native people aren't really comfortable using them. They're not comfortable burying a body. So even though they're now mandated that they have to use the cemeteries, well, okay, we'll still raise our coffins. In fact, if you look closely here, this is a Blackfeet cemetery. You'll see that most of the coffins are actually sitting on top of rocks. So they've still tried to elevate them as much as they can and get away with it. Finally, by the 1920s, mid-1920s I'll say, it is mandated that Native people bury their dead in cemetery reservations. The argument was for sanitation purposes. Interestingly enough, this decision comes shortly after World War I, when colonial people are really kind of made aware of how large numbers of decaying bodies can affect local communities from a hygienic standpoint. So the argument is that you need to bury your dead for hygienic purposes, but it has the dual implication and the dual, two birds, one stone. This is also forced assimilation, forcing people to step into and accept a cultural practice that they might not be completely comfortable with. The Holy Family Cemetery that you see here, even though it dates, its earliest internment is 1892 of another trapper, the first documented Native person buried here isn't until 1913. So over 20 years that this cemetery was in operation, but in Browning, like on the reservation, before it's actually used by Native peoples. It doesn't eliminate those scaffold burials. The iconic image still inspires a lot of people, and was even the theme. The depiction was used by Western artist J.K. Ralston for several of his paintings, including his well-known burial of Chief Blackwater. Interestingly enough, Chief Blackwater never existed. It's not a real person, but he had to depict the burial practice of it. The upper image you'll see is actually an unfinished painting in the Western Heritage Center collection that depicts all three versions of what we would call a scaffold burial. A high cliff face, a tree, and then a constructed scaffold too. Both of these were done 1950s and later. So here we are 30 plus years after the mandate for underground internment, and yet the image of a scaffold burial is still very much alive in the Western icon and the Western understanding. Even though I'm talking about Native burials and Native cemeteries, understanding that those terms are not entirely the right term for us, we do want to acknowledge that the existence of these practices, the existence of this practice, inspires and helps non-Native communities determine what they're going to do with their dead. Whether it's one person or whether it's many, they want to continue to use a place of death, an acknowledged place of death. That idea that you don't want to dig up a cemetery if you don't have to goes way, way back. And so if we put our dead where Native people are, then we eliminate that, because now our dead people will protect us from their dead people. It's really convoluted and backwards, but that's kind of the thinking that's coming through here. So when we think about non-Native cemeteries, the earliest understanding of those cemeteries falls into one of 4 categories. We see the domestic cemetery, which is actually on private land and is managed or cared for by the private landowner. It's usually a family plot that they have just opened up to their community. We have churchyards. By the way, does anybody know the difference between a cemetery and a churchyard? A churchyard, or a cemetery and a graveyard. So a graveyard is attached to a church. So your cemeteries that are in churchyards are actually graveyards, and those graveyards really have no organization. You have an open space, you dig a hole. Outside of, we see a lot of heavy social stratification within those. So you see people of a higher social status get to be closer to the church. In fact, the churches back east would actually draw out shade areas. So if your family member's grave could be in the shade of the church, you were really good. Those of the lower social classes were in the sunshine all the time. Town squares were really open areas. They tended to be very central. This was a place that even after you passed, you had a lot of visitors because it's where the market was, right? Very centrally located. Because they're used as a social space, they were never fenced. So there's no differentiation between community space, green space, and private property in those communities, in those areas. And then you have your pioneer graves. And your pioneer graves tended to be very isolated. You dig a hole where the person drops. The photograph that you see here is an acknowledged pioneer grave of an unknown person. The grave marker just says MM. We have no documentation of who that actually is. But those pioneer graveyards, unorganized, isolated, which means they are separated from community spaces. But a lot of times when a community would pop up at a later date, they would recognize that somebody is already here, so we'll just put our others here. The oldest cemetery in the Clarks Fork River Bottom Valley, where Billings is now located, illustrates all 4 of these, or components of all 4 of these categories. And that's Boot Hill Cemetery. Is anybody familiar with Boot Hill? Thank you. Martha doesn't count. Martha knows it all. Boot Hill Cemetery received its name because it's where the men who died with their boots on ended up. It's actually almost 2 miles from the city proper of Colson, right at the base of the place of the skull, right at the base of Skeleton Cliff. So remember, we talked about that a community, a non-Native community, would recognize a place of death, a place for the dead. So they recognized the Native remains that were in the crevices of the cliff face, and so they put their dead in the same location. Boot Hill Cemetery, as I mentioned, illustrates all 4 of those early American cemetery trends. It is isolated and separate from the community and connected to another place of death, just like those pioneer graves. It was completely unfenced, just like the town squares and the churchyard. There's no organization to it. You find an open spot, you dig a hole, and if you're lucky, they put a stone on top of you. And then it's separate from the community as a communal burial ground. The earliest burial, as we recognize it, is from 1852. It's a man named Dave Currier, who apparently, as the newspaper reported it, was watching a poker game and made, quote, an untimely remark which reflected on the honesty of the dealer. The gambler then stabbed him to death, fled, and was never captured. And then Dave had to gotta find a place to put him. It also kind of works to their advantage, or Dave's advantage, I guess, that Colston was right on the riverbanks of the Yellowstone River. So if they bury him near town, he's gonna get washed off at the next flood stage. And so, hey, look, there's a hill above flood level. It's already a place established for the dead. We'll put him there. By 1897, there were 52 marked graves, which you can see here, 1899. There are several marked graves. We have one fenced off. By the 1970s, if you're familiar with Boot Hill in the 1970s, it looks more like the picture here on the left. Those grave markers were put in by an Eagle Scout who did not make any effort to connect the marker with a known grave site. He just went in and set the markers up like he thought a grave should look. I applaud his effort and his attempt to honor the men who were buried in the cemetery. As a historian, it frustrates me. Luckily, in 2019, an MSU Billings project went to Boot Hill Cemetery with ground-penetrating radar. Their report, which was just released, found 172 anomalies. Now, those anomalies could be graves, or it could be a really, really big prairie dog den. We won't know entirely. You don't know if you don't go dig it up, but it is a cemetery, so it's not really something we're going to do. However, it does raise the question, 172. The last record that we have says 52 graves. That's way different, right? That's very, very different. Boot Hill is really the last illustration we have of a pioneer cemetery in the Billings area. Very quickly, once Billings is established, I won't go into the details of why we have Billings versus Colson. Just know it separates itself. When Billings is established, they're not going to take all of their people to Boot Hill once you have enough people living in Billings to justify their own city of their dead, their own cemetery. And so we see Billings establish their own domestic community-based cemetery. We're going to take a look at it because it's really unique, not only in Montana, but kind of across the country, because it grows from a domestic cemetery with components of all of those four things that we talked about to a city-owned, city-managed cemetery in one location. You don't really see that oftentimes. You don't have that in Helena. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And so the Billings Cemetery very much takes advantage and works off of the changes that are coming about with how you dispose of the dead after the American Civil War. The American Civil War completely changes American culture. You name a component of American culture, it is irrevocably changed as a result of the American Civil War. One of those is cemeteries and how you dispose of the dead. There's a couple reasons for that. One is because of the creation of national cemeteries. This idea that, previously in your rural and community cemeteries, you'd have families clumped together. And so you'd have big spaces between your family plots. National cemeteries, it's not like that. It is very regimented, military approach, right? There is a specific space and order to how people should be buried. There is also the first attempt and recognition that we have to dispose of people hygienically, because with your national cemeteries and your battlefield burial sites, you've got a lot of dead bodies, and it's going to take you too long to bury them before they start becoming a public health issue. And so there's this complete improvement and change in the technology and the science about how we deal with the dead. And embalming is one of the major components of that. If we can embalm a body, we can preserve it long enough till we can actually get it in the ground, and then it doesn't affect our health. That has the added benefit for specifically Union officers that they don't want to be buried in rebel soil. They want to be shipped home. And so if we're able to embalm their body, we can slow decomposition long enough that we can ship them from Savannah, Georgia, back to New York City. So think about, we actually see the science of embalming really becoming common American knowledge and common American practice as a result of Abraham Lincoln's assassination, because they actually took his body on a multi-state, several-month-long parade across the country before they got him back to Illinois to be buried in the family plot. That would only be possible with the scientific advancements in embalming and slowing decomposition that are a direct result of the American Civil War. We also see as communities continue to grow after the Civil War, we see a rise in immigration, we see a rise in the birth rate, surprise, surprise, that this concept of having a cemetery directly in the boundaries of your community or right next to the boundaries of your community no longer feasible, because you got to have that space. We have more people. They need a place to live. They need a place to live. They need a place to buy groceries. They need a place to buy groceries. They need a place to work. On and on and on and on. And so this is when city planning, the concepts of city planning, start being moved from actually planning cities to planning cemeteries. So think about a lot of our cemeteries today. They have roads, they have lanes, they have tree lines. If you didn't know this was a cemetery, it would kind of look like a neighborhood. And so we see these concepts applied to communities of the living. We also see them applied to communities of the dead. We see this further illustrated as communities back east grow. People are moving west. This is at the height of westward expansion, right? 1860s is when we really start seeing non-native people moving into Montana kind of en masse, and those populations growing into the 1870s and 1880s, leading all the way up to statehood. Those rural communities are now taking these concepts of orderly burials with embalming, which means we can separate them from we have time to move people outside of the community. We have time to honor their life through wakes and funerals. They don't have to happen right away. These concepts of city planning, and it helps change American attitudes around death itself. So American Civil War and before, death is very much a daily thing. You know, there's a reason families didn't name their children until their children were several weeks old. It's because you didn't know if they were going to die or not. Before embalming, if somebody died, you'd have somebody sit with them as a wake to make sure they were dead. And then you would bury them the next day because you didn't want the decomposition of the body to affect the family's health. Well, as science improves, medical health science improves, we have a greater faith in doctors and hospitals that we're going to keep people healthy, we're going to keep them longer, and people are going to get sick and we can heal them. Death is no longer something we have to worry about on an hourly, day-to-day basis. We also see the improvements, as I mentioned, with embalming. We don't have to bury people right away. We can ship them to wherever they need to go. And so because of this, cemeteries start getting separated more and more and more. They become further and further and further away from the communities themselves because we don't want to think about death. Death is scary. We don't think about what comes after. And so we're going to put it out of our sight and out of our mind until we absolutely need it. And then we see this mirrored with the rise of pest houses. I don't know if you're not familiar, pest houses were basically isolation hospitals where they would send people who had contagious and communicable diseases, primarily smallpox, but it was used for other diseases. Those pest houses were pushed outside of town, separated from the rest of the community, and when those people died, you didn't want to bring those bodies back in town to bury them. You took them to the cemetery. So you wanted it as far away as possible. We also see the rise in understanding of the need for community public space. So when you have a community that's recognizing that green space is important to the quality of life of the people who are living here, do we have space in our communities already set aside as parks? For many people, that was a great big no, and if they did, it was a dirt patch. So you as a family, are you going to go have a picnic in the dirt patch, Or are you going to go to a green space that's already cared for, that's already acknowledged by the community, and hey, by the way, you can go have dinner with your great Aunt Susie who died 3 years ago? And so we see this huge growth in the recognition of cemeteries as community parks, as community green spaces, as those open spaces in the communities, those churchyards, those town squares, as they start being dug up for community development. You're not going to dig up the community cemetery. So it's now protected green space. By the way, if you weren't aware, New York City's Central Park is one of the earliest cemeteries in New York City. It's the same concept, right? Cemeteries as green spaces. And so this leads me to the understanding of the Billings Cemetery. We're going to fly a little bit here. The Billings Cemetery, separate from Boot Hill, illustrates a concept from a pioneer grave to a domestic community cemetery to a city-owned cemetery to a city-planned cemetery, all in one place. It illustrates the growth, the national trend that we have with cemetery development in one location. The Billings Cemetery was originally part of the Daniel Larson homestead. Daniel Larson's 2 children, the first child we only know as M. Larson. We know it was a daughter. I like to think of her as Mary. That I can't confirm that. As historians, we tend to name people if we don't have a name for them. His daughter dies, and he buries her on the hill a little bit away and above where the family home is located. This kind of opens up his eyes as the opportunity of like, you know what? I can actually sell plot land and open this to the community and make a little bit of extra money because I already know I'm going to care for and take care of Mary, of M, and his son Charlie's graves. So M. Larson is buried right at the end of 1881, the beginning of 1882. By 1883, Daniel has invited a surveyor to come out and actually survey 5 acres of his homestead to set aside as a cemetery that he is going to open to the community. And the first community member buried in this area is Mr. Rich, who was interred in January 4th, 1884. Daniel then takes it on himself to care for the area. So remember, pioneer grave, M. Larson, isolated. Now it's a domestic cemetery that is being cared for by the landowner. In 1889, Daniel sells his entire homestead to Edward O'Donnell, who is an Irish immigrant, and that sale includes the Billings Cemetery, as we can see here. By this time, so by 1889, it has grown from 5 acres to 10 acres. We start to see Ed really recognize the responsibility that comes with not only owning, but caring for a community cemetery. He starts illustrating some planning. You can actually see in the upper corner, the cemetery plot and how it's been separated out. He is now getting ready to start fencing it to separate it from his own agricultural interests. And then he takes it upon himself to care for the land. For a lot of early rural cemeteries, care of your family's grave site fell on you. If you wanted the grass to look nice, if you wanted flowers there, you came in and took care of it. Ed, as we see here in the newspaper, Ed is actually advertising, hey, if you want somebody else to care for it, let me know, and there'll be a small fee, but then you don't have to worry about it. And so we see Ed step in and taking on the responsibility as a cemetery manager. He doesn't just own it. Now he's managing the landscape around him. By the way, he starts calling it God's Acre. So he starts caring for God's Acre. Ed was actually a staunch Catholic, Irish Catholic. He went on to have 17 children. Bless his wife, Mary. All 17 children, Ed and his wife, are now interred at Billings Cemetery. So it truly was a family process, a family product. As he starts developing and planning the cemetery, we see him expand his market base, if you will. He starts selling land, selling plots as family groups, not just as single graves. He starts selling plots to the city and to the county for potter's graves, so burial places for people who couldn't afford a burial. He's selling to an incredibly diverse group of people. I will point out to you, we see, like those early churchyard cemeteries, a clumping and social stratification. So the ironwork and large monuments, if you can afford to put a large monument and put iron around your grave, you probably have some money to spare. You'll see how they are clumped together. So you put all of the people who know each other and who have means together. I will also point out to you these two pale pink rectangles at the top. Those are suspected mass grave sites from the flu of 1918 in Billings. But it's interesting that for us that those areas were still open and available for those mass grave locations. So it shows us that Ed is very intentional about planning who's purchasing what plot sections. The small square kind of roughly in the middle is James Webb, Sheriff James Webb, who was killed in the line of duty in 1904. And I point that out because that's the 1904 photograph that we see here, is of his grave. And if you look closely, here is where it is. This is the same headstone. So this headstone and this headstone are the same. And we can see the growth in the cemetery. There's large monuments, there's small monuments, there are wooden stones, there are rocks, there are fences, there are concrete berms. There's no organization about who can have what monument and marker. While Billings Cemetery does not have ethnic sections, racial sections in the cemetery, it is interesting to note that members of the Asian community who were buried in Billings tend to be clumped together towards the outside edges specifically. Billings was actually a site where immigrants from Asia, specifically China, who died in other surrounding communities in eastern Montana, those bodies were actually shipped to Billings to be buried with people from their own country. And then the accepted practice was that 10 years later, those bones would be dug up and the skeletal remains would be returned to China. We don't have any specific evidence of that happening in Billings, but we know that was the accepted practice, which we will see in a little bit because it happened here in Helena. Pick it up. All right, so Ed O'Donnell also started selling land to the city for potter's graves. The first mention in the Billings newspaper is in June 1899 with C.W. Dwyer, who was a piano player in a prostitution house. He actually committed suicide in jail. And the city was then tasked with burying him with no place to do it. And so Ed O'Donnell starts selling land to both the city and the county for those potter's graves. Today, it is suspected that most of those potter's graves are under the roadway because they went unmarked and mostly uncatalogued. Ed O'Donnell died in 1918, and his wife, his widow, Mary, sells the land to the city of Billings in 1920. The city had to create a specific tax levy to raise the funds to buy the land, and then they named Ed's son, James, as the first official cemetery superintendent. See, family care all the way across. The city, I love, by the way, that they included the future cemetery extension. If you go to Billings, this is now the golf course. So here in 50 years, we could potentially be burying people on the golf course at Billings. The city immediately starts making changes, and they issue several city ordinances to homogenize the markers at the cemetery. So there are no more giant headstones next to wooden crosses. Now, if you're going to be buried there, there is a minimum visual headstone marker that you have to use. And we can see that here. I think the earliest burial in this area is 1918 or 1919. And we can see that those city ordinances come into effect immediately. The city also takes advantage of a revisited cultural phenomenon of the mausoleum. The community mausoleum project really became popular in the 1870s, but skyrocketed in the 1920s because of a rise of entombment and cremation, because it was cheaper than a burial. You know, if we think about what's happening in Montana in the 1920s, it's a huge depression, so finances is an issue. We also see a rise in this understanding of the democratization of death. Everybody is equal in death. You can't take it with you, and so everybody should be buried the same. The mausoleum was designed by architect J.G. Link, who did the wing of the Capitol building, so connection. He himself is actually entombed in the mausoleum. It opened in 1921 to great fanfare and popularity, and today there are 330 crypts, and there are still several open, so if you really, really want to be entombed in the building's mausoleum, you better get on it. We see this process, we see it happening here in Helena too. This is not a Billings-specific thing. This is happening in other places. The difference, though, is that here in Helena, it's not happening in one location. We see it over several locations, including the Benton Avenue Cemetery. So the Benton Avenue Cemetery was initially established as 10 acres, purchased and established by the Lewis and Clark County Commissioners, and at the time, in 1871, it was outside of town. It was way outside of town. We can see immediately that it's taking that city planning concept into effect. It's divided into 4 quadrants. It's got roadways all the way around it. The graves in it are roughly in shape. They're roughly in line. We also see it used a little bit as a park and a public space. It was an incredibly popular gathering place, in large part because of the high traffic that was on Benton Avenue. There were so many people using Benton Avenue that it actually became one of the most popular parade routes through town. In May of 1883, when Helena celebrated the first observance of Decoration Day, it went right down Benton Avenue, right into the cemetery. However, because it was established by the county, there was no one person responsible for caring for the cemetery. And we're going to see that. I'm going to I'd like to take the time to read this to you. This was printed by the Helena Independent in May 1883. It says, Helena celebrated the first observance of Decoration Day with a mile-long procession that made its way out of the city to the Helena Cemetery, the Benton Avenue Cemetery. Nearly 1,500 people participated in the march, including 50 veterans of the Civil War and a few veterans of the war with Mexico. Ladies and gentlemen in carriages joined the crowd at the cemetery, and flowers and evergreens were laid upon the graves of the veterans. This observance, the Helena Daily Herald pointed out later, brought to light the deplorable condition of the city's Protestant and Catholic cemeteries, whose wooden head and footboards had deteriorated and could not be deciphered. Quote, the newspaper article quotes another newspaper article that says, some of the noblest men and women lie buried there, yet their resting places cannot be identified. After considerable inquiry, we do not find that the plot of the lots is kept. The county gravedigger keeps no record of interments. He digs a hole, covers a corpse, and the name of the dead is buried in the same oblivion as the body. So 1871 to 1883, we're only 12 years into the use of the cemetery, and we're already seeing some issues, not the least of which is the fact that it was unfenced. And because of the open range livestock, there were massive issues of cattle coming in. This cracks me up. There is no fence around the Benton Avenue Cemetery, and the cattle have pawed great holes in some of the graves. I'm sure it was a lovely image for those who were coming down Benton Avenue. Interestingly enough, it's not until 1913 that the community raises the funds to fence the cemetery. So this is an issue all the way back and acknowledged in 83. It takes another 30 years. I can't add, guys. 30 years for this to happen. Finally, by 1922, a group of community members comes together to take responsibility for care of the cemetery, and they do that through a $5 membership. So you pay the $5, and this organization will then take on the care and responsibility. Interestingly enough, by the time that this organization is established, the Benton Avenue Cemetery Association, burials at the cemetery have really slacked off. We see a huge decline in the number of burials at Benton Avenue Cemetery from the 1920s until the 1960s. And the last really acknowledged burial at the cemetery is really in the 60s. And that's because everybody has shifted their focus to an outside of the town, outside of the community cemetery, called Forest Vale. Yep, right? So Forest Vale was really interning people as early as 1890, but it's about the turn of the century that it really becomes popular. So we see Benton Avenue popularity come down and Forest Vale coming up. Part of that is because Forest Vale is secular. Benton Avenue was Protestant. The early cemetery by Central School was Catholic. This is a secular cemetery. They don't care who you are, what you do. You can be buried here. Forest Vale, as the secular cemetery, though, 2.5 miles outside of town, so we see Helena taking on that practice of separating the cemetery from the community. They take it a step further by hiring a park landscape architect to design the way the cemetery should look. So Harry Wheeler steps forward and wants to fill the cemetery as a rural park. So he uses mature trees, landscaping, tree-lined paths, monuments, mausoleums, columbariums, and arbor gardens. He even adds a lake and island in the middle of the park, I keep calling it a park because that's what he wanted, in the middle of the cemetery. And I have to admit, so when they first purchased the land, by the way, the newspaper called it a desolate, ugly, and treeless locale. So Harry steps in and really makes it a beautiful, usable, quality space. And I have to acknowledge, it still looks like that. It could still very well be a public park if it weren't for the giant marble monuments every 4 or 5 feet. So when we're thinking about Forest Vale, it has a lot of similarities with the Mount View section of the Billings Cemetery. But there is one pretty distinct difference. In Mount View, there is no ethnic section, but anybody could purchase a plot in the cemetery. Forest Vale distinctly keeps its Asian burials outside of the cemetery boundaries. And so if you were to go visit Chinese Row today, the prairie has taken it over. It's not managed and maintained as a park the way Forest Vale is. And that's because those burials are outside of the boundaries. It's not part of the cemetery. At its height, Helena's Asian community made up 20% of the city's population. And yet, there are over 200 burials at Chinese Row outside of Forest Vale. We do see evidence, though. We do have historical documentation and newspaper reports detailing how Helena's Chinese community specifically would go into this area, disinter the bodies, and return them to the home communities, mostly in China. There were actually people in Billings that was their job. That was specifically what they did. And in 1881, the Helena newspaper details how they actually used Chinese miners to go in and sift the soil to make sure that they got every single bone, because the wooden boxes had completely deteriorated by that point. So while we don't have documentation of that in Billings, we do here in Helena. So we can establish this as a process. Today, only 9 marble headstones remain in the China Rose section, although a number of deteriorated and illegible wooden and metal markers can be found. If you have an interest in this particular community, I highly recommend you to, check out Mark Johnson's website. Mark Johnson, the author and professor, he and his students actually have worked very diligently to translate the kanji on many of these markers in cemeteries across Montana. And his website is so incredibly informative about this specific community within the cemetery movement. And so what I'd like to do is take the last little bit of our time together, because we've talked about the planning, the administration. Why do cemeteries look the way they look, right? I don't want us to lose the humanity in the cities of the dead. I want us to acknowledge the fact that these areas are full of people who led incredibly vibrant lives. They had hopes, they had dreams, they had fears, they had family that missed them terribly. And one of the ways for us to do that is to look at the way these people are remembered. Not necessarily in word, but in the monuments that their families chose to leave on their resting place. And so we're going to take a look at some of the symbolism and iconography used in some of these cemeteries and some of these markers. Because you can walk into Forest Vale and look at the beautiful trees, walk down a lovely tree-lined path, think you're in a park until you look to the side and see a last name with a beautiful design carved into stone. What does that mean, and why did they choose that bouquet of flowers in particular? Well, most of that iconography comes from Victorian understandings. It's really funny to me that the Victorian era is really pretty much over in Europe by, the American Civil War. It really doesn't last much longer than that. However, that's right when it's becoming popular in the Americas. And so all of the stuff that they were doing in England in the 1820s and 1830s, we start doing in the 1870s and 1880s. Sometimes we're behind the ball. It's fine. So a lot of the symbolism that we use is rooted in the Victorian iconography of the previous several decades. Not the least of which is the use of arches. So arched entrances symbolize victory and death. This amazing progression where you step from life into death and have victory over the pains and sorrows of the world. We use them as portals, as main entrances into the cemetery, because the passageway symbolizes a step into eternal life. And so as you're stepping forward under an arch into the cemetery, it represents a victorious movement from one style of being to another. Kind of symbolic even in that. The archway that you see here at the bottom, the Hope of Peace Cemetery here in Helena is considered to be the longest active cemetery in the state of Montana. It is for sure the longest active Jewish cemetery in the state of Montana. It's actually a really beautiful place if you ever have the chance. The portal entry was actually erected by Morris Sands in memory of his wife in 1907. So he specifically commissioned the building of this archway to honor his wife and her passage into eternal life. Sometimes the most obvious thing that you see in a cemetery, simply because it looks different and looks like it doesn't belong, is the use of iron fencing. Usually when you see iron fencing, it separates and encloses a family area. So everybody who is buried inside the fencing has some relation to each other. I want to point out to you, though, that if you see iron fencing, I want you to acknowledge it and look at it, because it's kind of rare. And the reason for that is because during World War I and World War II, iron became very, very necessary. And so a lot of cities would basically go to people and say, we're going to give you the chance to voluntarily pull your iron fencing from your family plot and donate it to the war cause. They give them a couple weeks and then they come back and say, okay, it's no longer voluntary. We are now going to confiscate the ironwork in the cemeteries. So if there is historic ironwork in your cemeteries, as the Benton Avenue Cemetery has, it means it somehow survived 2 world wars. Oftentimes, when ironwork was not available, we really see the rise and growth of it, of the use of cement berms and cement walkways. Hope of Peace is perfect to illustrate this. Or, I'm sorry, they have families clustered together, not only with the cement or marble separation that you see here, but they also have walkways, like established walkways between the family plots. It's really beautiful and really fun to kind of walk around and see, who is a neighbor in the afterlife, in the city of the dead. Most times, when you see something like this, there'll be a large family marker that has the last name, and then individual burials or individual graves will have a smaller marker with a full name, birth date, death date, on and on and on. But you do have people who like to do it all for themselves, and so we have one person buried in this plot, and he wants everybody to know who he is, that he had the money to buy 3 plots, not just one. Although I will give him credit, his wife is buried with him, although her name is listed on the bottom of the marker at the back. There is a couple buried at Mount View, by the way, where the husband is buried at the wife's feet. And if you have interest, I can tell you about her later because she's phenomenal in her own right. This is David Fratt. The Fratt family was very influential and important in the Billings community. They actually donated money to have what is now the building where the city offices are located. So he had the means, and he wanted everybody to know about it even after he had died. On those memorials and markers themselves, the iconography that they would use, his particular monument has an Ionian? No, that's wrong. It has a Greek column top to it, and I'm sorry, I'm spacing on the...
Ionic?
Ionic, thank you, Ionic, I appreciate that. Others use engravings and symbolism much more targeted. So this particular monument is for Jenny Peters, and it was erected by her husband Archibald in 1894. And every side of the column has a different bronze molding, a different bronze image on it. The first one you see here is a wreath. The garland swag here. The garland swag represents victory in death, followed by the hourglass, which looks at the end of her time on earth and passing her life into eternity, followed by a wreath, which illustrates peace in death. There are bowing angels underneath of that wreath that you see there. Those bowing angels are supposed to be her guide to heaven. And then on the last side is a dove to illustrate her flight into eternity and her purity and spirituality. The entire column is topped by an urn, which represents her mortality. And so in this marker, her husband is acknowledging her purity and the hope that she finds peace in her journey from her mortal life into eternal life. It's a lovely sentiment that he communicates through the marker that we're still interpreting. Here we are 130 years later. It's pretty impressive. The urn that you see here that he used is a pretty standard, just regular, unadorned urn. They can get much more elaborate. This particular urn at Benton Avenue, it's actually been eroded and broken, but if you get up close to it, you can see that it actually has a base for a flame. And so if you see an urn with a flame coming from the top, that with the blaze, it represents undying friendship and immortality. Usually that choice has been made or that monument has been made, is put in not by a family member, but by a friend or a social organization. If the urn is draped, like you see here, it represents the veil between life on earth and life after death. Of course, the plain urn just represents mortality and the passing of mortality in life. And then you also will often see a drape, rather than having it on the urn, you'll see the drape just over the top of the column. Sometimes they'll pair that with an urn on top of it. That drape by itself represents a partition between life and death and is supposed to serve as a protector for the spirit of the person who is interred there. Flowers are an incredibly popular motif, even coming into today. The iconography of flowers, if you see a bouquet, both of these headstones at Forest Vale have bouquets of flowers. A bouquet represents sorrow and grief, as the family, the survivors are dealing with their grief, the loss of the person. Lilies, which are illustrated on both of these headstones here, are an emblem of innocence and purity. You usually see lilies engraved on a woman's headstone. And then the good kind marker has morning glories on the front. They're above the name. The morning glory usually represents and acknowledges the beginning of life. It's used a lot with children or people who are very young, but it can also be used to represent the fact that this person has young survivors. So they had children or grandchildren of a young age that are living on after them. Unfortunately, one of the saddest things that we see and we recognize in these cemeteries are the markers for children. It's always gut-wrenching, even for us, when we go in and we see a grouping of children's markers. As the historian, I usually look at the death date because you can tell when childhood epidemics sweep through a community, when you have a cluster of children's graves from a specific time period. The Billings Cemetery actually has a large number in 1916 because there was a huge polio epidemic that came through the community at that time. Oftentimes you'll see children's graves outlined just themselves with the cement or the marble outline. Lambs are incredibly common, representing innocence and purity and young life. You'll often see childhood, angels, children and angels, or doves as well. You don't see it as often, but it's very symbolic. The Billings Cemetery lamb is kneeling in front of a tree trunk where the limbs have been cut off. And that the removal of those limbs represents a life that has been cut too short. And so it's important for us to realize that today we take the cemeteries and we put it outside of town, and we only go to the cemetery when we go to a funeral, right? So we only tend to go to the funeral when we're in heels and a skirt and it's cold, and gentlemen, you're wearing shoes you haven't worn, or wearing a suit that you haven't worn since the last time somebody died. Maybe it's time for us to start visiting cemeteries when we have a free afternoon, just to acknowledge the people who live there, but also to take a moment to acknowledge the intention behind those cemeteries. What's the earliest burial at your cemetery? Is it a pioneer who then inspired an entire community to leave the rest of their community members there? Is it a place where Native people used? And even though those Native bodies are no longer there for us to honor, we can at least acknowledge the home place, the ancestral homeland of these people. Is it a space that was designed to be a park? It was designed to be used by the living as much as the dead, and yet we no longer do that. And so I encourage you to just take a minute and think about the cemeteries in the community where you live. We may have talked about them here a little bit, and maybe go spend a little time, wonder who was there and how they lived and what they did. And so I really appreciate all of the time that you guys dedicated with me. We went a hair over, but I get really excited. So if we have the opportunity, I would love to open the floor to any questions that you have, and I will do my best to answer them.
And actually, because we are filming, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand and I will pass the mic to you. And you can speak into the mic to answer your questions, and then the people who are watching YouTube can hear you. So, any questions?
This may be a bit picky, but that Hope of Peace Cemetery, the arch on it actually said Home of Peace.
Thank you. I appreciate that correction. Home of Peace. I had home in my notes. I didn't make it on the caption. I appreciate that. So I'll acknowledge that correction. Then it's Home of Peace Cemetery here in Helena. Question here?
In the one cemetery you showed us with the different colors,
Yes.
there was 3 with the darker red and
Yes.
the children. So at what time were children grouped together and why?
Usually when you see children grouped together, it is an epidemic. That you have families coming in who have not purchased a family plot, and now all of a sudden 3 children of their family have died. What are they going to do? So they go and they buy a single plot. And when you see children grouped together, it means a lot of people have bought single plots for children within a few weeks or even a few months of each other. And so if there's a large grouping like we see at Mount View, one of those groupings is 1916, one of those groupings is 1905 when a smallpox epidemic comes through. We had a diphtheria outbreak in the 1920s, and so we see another smaller grouping at that time. So it's never been the practice to just always put children in one place. It's a clumping of circumstance is really what that means.
So there's obviously a lot of pioneer graves scattered amongst Montana. How is there any efforts to kind of qualify those and document those at all, or is it just hit and miss?
That's a really challenging question. I am not aware of an organized effort through like MTHS or local museums. However, community volunteers are the lifeblood of grave documentation. And that is very evident if anybody spends any time on findagrave.com. Because if you do just a search for Montana cemeteries, 50% of the cemeteries that come up are a cemetery of one, which means it is likely a pioneer or a family cemetery that never actually expanded to include more of the family. So volunteers are driving that effort forward, and they're using open source like Find a Grave to do that. And that, I guess to me that makes sense too, because so much of that knowledge is community-based. And so for an institution to do that, it would be very resource-heavy. And that's not to say that it's not an important project, because it absolutely is. But it's not a project that often gets priority within the limited resources that are available.
So some grave sites have a head and a foot stone. And where did that come from? And we don't do that anymore, really, I don't think.
The reason we don't do that mostly anymore is because of city ordinances and cemetery rules that dictate what you can do. It's usually personal preference. We see footstones, foot markers in Billings Cemetery. We see them in, I think Benton Avenue actually has a couple foot places. Reservation cemeteries have a lot of foot markers. I think my favorite is actually at the Sacagawea Cemetery in Wyoming on the Shoshone Reservation, because there are a lot of bed frames, and so you have a headboard as the head marker and the footboard as the foot of the grave. I don't think we see it as much anymore because the cemeteries have gotten rid of that, but mostly it was personal preference.
Is it just to show
It just marks the edge. If you have say you have somebody that's really super tall and you want to make sure that the people who dig the next hole down don't hit your marker, you can put a little mark there. More in a lot of ways, for sure.
When my father passed away, we decided to bury him on the ranch on a hill. Mm-hmm. We didn't ask anybody if that's legal or illegal or.
Maybe we should strike that from the recording.
Yeah.
There are a lot of family cemeteries in Montana, even in the last 5 years. To my knowledge, there is not a statewide law banning that, probably because there are so many agricultural families that have that practice. If you inter somebody within city limits or within an established cemetery, you have to abide by the rules and the ordinances set by that community. Otherwise, I think they just say try to find high ground and don't pollute the water source. And please don't quote me on that. If anybody comes after you, do not quote Lauren Hunley and say that she said it was okay. I don't want to step into that.
There was a graveyard next to what is now the St. Andrew's School west of town, and I've heard that the gravestones were just dumped, like at various, like at Spring Meadow Lake even, and I don't know if those were, if those graves were actually dug up and moved. Do you have any idea what happened over there in that cemetery?
So not being a Helena historian, I cannot speak to specifics of that. I do know that there were several bodies from the older cemeteries that were disinterred and moved to the Benton Avenue Cemetery. Some of them came with their markers and some of them did not. There is a precedent, not just in Montana, but across the West and across the country, that if you disturb bones in construction for a long, long time, you just kind of shoved them out of the way. It hasn't been until the last 30 or 40 years-ish that there are laws in place that say that you have to report them and the archaeologist has to come and cultural resource management and all of that. There was an ethical expectation that you would report them. That doesn't necessarily mean it happened. And there are cases today that people still do. They come across, road construction, you come across a bone. Well, whoops, we lost it. Unfortunately, that there is a precedent, and we see it a lot with road construction that is coming in on a place where a cemetery was or used to be. I can't speak specifically to that case, but I do know of similar cases in other areas that it really depends on who was in charge and whether or not they took the moral stance to do it one way or the other. Making you walk back and forth, Martha. Get your steps in.
I can actually help you out with some of those last questions.
Great.
My name is Carrie Jones. I used to be a treasurer for the Benton Avenue Cemetery Association. You will find that in Helena, many times older cemeteries people were disinterred and moved to other cemeteries when it was popular. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they moved the headstones and sometimes they didn't. And sometimes they moved the headstones and not the bodies several times. And sometimes they buried them within the confines of the cemeteries and sometimes they didn't. If you ever have a chance to go into some of the backyards around the Benton Avenue Cemetery, there are headstones in people's backyards and maybe bodies, but we're not really sure and we haven't got ground penetrating radar to go look at it. So,
personal, it's whoever's in charge.
yeah, and the thing is that there were so many small cemeteries scattered around in Helena before they consolidated into Forestvale that it's impossible to keep track of. But I do have a question, which is, even though the time frame is not well for it, do we have any slave cemeteries in Montana?
Not to my knowledge, specifically for slaves. When we see a marked rise in Black American populations, it's post-Civil War. And so these would no longer be enslaved people. However, there are cemeteries, just like we see with our Asian section, where people tend to want to be buried near people that they know, people that they share cultural practices with, people that they share cultural understandings with. There are actually several Hmong families in Billings that have their families, even though they're not related, they still have chosen to bury their family member together, so that when they have their celebrations, their death celebrations, they go as a community and have grave meals as a community. So It's not technically a slave section. It's not technically a section of the cemetery for enslaved people. However, we see clumps of formerly enslaved people, clumps of immigrants from Mexico, clumps of immigrants from Asia, on and on and on and on. Whether that's mandated by the cemetery is individual to the cemetery. But we do see that happening organically as well. Any other questions?
Can you repeat the Forest Vale? Can you
Yes.
repeat who funded the Forest Vale Cemetery? Because you said how elaborate it was, and that they hired somebody, but who hired it?
So Forest Vale was purchased by a group of investors who purchased the total 160 acres. And it looks like they managed it, and they're the ones who selected civil engineer Harry Wheeler. And then it passed into the administration that now has it. The MTHS marker and the interpretation that I found did not name those investors, outside of just saying a group of Helena investors. Okay.
All right, well, thank you so much to Lauren. Please thank
Thank you
her.
guys for coming.
That was quite wonderful.